When you think of a lost city, you might be thinking of Machu Picchu, Ciudad Perdida, Troy, Babylon, or maybe the legendary city of Atlantis. But did you know we have lost cities in England too? It's remarkable to think that in this small and crowded island, some important settlements have become a shadow of their former selves, or in some cases have vanished almost entirely. Where were these missing settlements, and why were they lost? Welcome back to YeOldeGuide for a special episode on the lost cities of England. Well, it's a delight as ever to have historian Daniel Gooch in the studio for another special episode on the history of settlements in England. Now, in our last episode, Daniel, we were talking about medieval cities, and lost cities came up. So that's what we're talking about today, right?
Yep, that's right. This is almost a bit of a follow-up to the recent medieval cities episode. We had a few fascinating examples of lost cities that came up that we didn't have time to cover in depth. So we thought we'd add a few more into the mix and cover that topic in its own right because it's so fascinating. Like most of our other special episodes, we aren't doing our usual thing of reviewing the places by different categories. Instead, we're going to talk a bit more about how these towns grew, why they were notable in their time, and what happened to them, including what might be there today. The fact that we're only covering places that were quite large and notable means we aren't going to be covering some of the famous smaller examples of lost settlements, like the possible drowned Mesolithic settlements of Doggerland in the North Sea, villages drowned under reservoirs like Derwent, or say some of the villages of Durham that were left to decline after the 1950s. It's cities or, in their day, large towns only today. And not all of these places that we'll cover today have disappeared completely. Some cases, there is a continuing settlement, but there are all places that were very significant in a particular way, whether for trade, ecclesiastical influence, or strategic importance. And most importantly for us, whose economy, influence, or size have now dwindled to either nothing or just a fraction of what it was.
I'm amused that you mentioned the Doggerland.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't know where the Doggerland is, by the way, that's perfectly understandable. It's somewhere underneath the North Sea. You might recognise it from the shipping forecasts. It's been hidden for about 8,000 years, but I'm glad you were thorough in mentioning it, Daniel, because we don't want to miss anything out, but it's out of scope for this episode.
That's right, yeah. No, not so much marine archaeology today, although there is a little bit actually in our first city. Should we get straight into it?
Let's go on to our first city, which I believe is Dunwich.
Dunwich,
I've been to Dunwich, actually. I went years ago for my GCSE geography project on coastal erosion, and I think that gives a bit of a clue as to what's going on at Dunwich. Tell us about Dunwich.
Yeah, you couldn't really pick a better place, quite frankly, if you're studying coastal erosion. Dunwich is right on the Suffolk coast against the shore cliffs in the most easterly part of England. We've picked Dunwich because this had probably the greatest fall from prominence of, I'd say, any town in English history. Once it was a vast Saxon commercial centre. It was a grand medieval trading port, but massive coastal erosion has reduced it to today a tiny village of just a couple of hundred people. It's one of hundreds of North Sea coastal towns that have been lost to erosion or flooding over the last millennium. But Dunwich was the largest of these and a really important place at its height. David Hinton described it as the country's greatest urban loss by the end of the 13th century. So while we have other examples today of new planned towns that never grew as expected, Dunwich was a city that had been large and important for centuries and subsequently almost disappeared, which is why we definitely couldn't cover lost cities without Dunwich going first.
So how old is Dunwich? Where did it come from? Where did it start?
It probably started as a Roman settlement and became East Anglia's most important commercial city under the Anglo-Saxons. It may have been, it's a matter of speculation, but it may have been the capital of the Kingdom of East Anglia for a time, and possibly the seat of a bishop in the 7th century. But then later, after the Norman conquest, the town grew considerably. There were churches, a hospital, religious houses, a thriving shipbuilding industry, along with fishing, agriculture and trade. It received a charter under King John, like Ipswich, Suffolk's biggest town today. We can gauge some idea of Dunwich's importance with a few statistics. At one point, its port was thought to be the third largest in England. One notable historian still names it one of the 9 regional centres of England in the late 12th century, behind London, of course. It had at its height 10 churches and 2 friaries to go along with its port and its trades.
So it's absolutely remarkable that it might have been in the top 10 most important settlements. I think a population of 3,000 is what I've seen, which at the time would have been enormous. So it was a big and important place. What led to its downfall?
Okay, well, the scene is set. You've got here one of the most important towns in East Anglia by the time of the Norman conquest, but it's already undergoing this process of coastal erosion even by that point. What happened to really cause its decline and abandonment were a series of huge storms. There were 2 in 1286 and then 1287, which were major turning points. Prior to these, it's thought that most storm damage in Dunwich had been to the harbour, but by this point, the shoreline had reached the limits of the town, and these storms in 1286 and 87 washed a significant number of buildings away, a trend which continued later, and one pretty creditable theory goes, further caused Dunwich's decline by causing people to abandon the city and fail to maintain its coastal defences, especially when its harbour became blocked up. There were more storms that followed in the 14th century, one in 1347 that destroyed 400 homes, and erosion continued to the point that the edge of the cliff top that you can see today has moved more than a mile inland. There's a great computer rendering that Time Team did when they visited Dunwich, showing the extent of the shoreline in the Middle Ages.
So this process of erosion, and it's remarkable to think it's a mile, and it's a huge distance. I'm picturing now, like looking out to sea from the cliff top at Dunwich, thinking a mile was an area that would have been populated. How did people react?
Well, after the abandonment of Dunwich, the consequence was a town that was already ghostly even by Tudor times. By 1525, this formerly great town was well on its way down. It was ranked only the 69th town in the country by the number of taxpayers. And by the early 1600s, William Camden was writing about a certain peculiar spite and envy of nature that suffereth the greedy sea to have what it will and encroach still without all end. It lieth desolate, he said of Dunwich. Later, in the 1720s, Daniel Defoe visited, and he noted its decline then. He said, even this town seems to be in danger of being swallowed up, for fame reports that once they had 50 churches in the town, I saw but one left, and not half full of people.
It's absolutely extraordinary. And what's the legacy of Dunwich now?
Well, for a long time, Dunwich's main continuing legacy was political. Despite its tiny diminished size, it retained 2 MPs until the abolition of the separate Dunwich constituency in 1832 with the Great Reform Act. At one point, it had 1 MP for every 100 inhabitants and a tiny number of registered voters. Equivalent representation for London at the time would have led to London having 19,000 MPs. So you can really see how disproportionate it was. This meant it was an infamous rotten borough, as they were called. The Dunwich constituency was parodied in the episode of Blackadder Series 3, where they get Baldric elected to Parliament by buying a rotten borough, Dunny on the Wold, half an acre of southern marshland in Suffolk with the population of about half a dozen animals. Now, in a physical sense, while there is still a tiny village of Dunwich there today, there's almost nothing of the former city. All you have remaining of medieval Dunwich today are the ruins of a Franciscan priory and of the Lep Hospital and a buttress of All Saints Church, which was saved and added to St James's Church, which was built some way inland in the 1830s and is the town's last remaining religious building. You also have one single late 17th century gravestone from All Saints Church, which has long since fallen into the sea, about 4 metres from the cliff edge. And even all this probably won't last much longer because erosion is continuing today. When I walked through Dunwich recently and I walk up the Suffolk coast just last year, my walk was diverted because of the imminent threat of erosion. That Time Team episode estimated that around a decade ago that the remainder of Dunwich will all be gone within 100 years of that date. So possibly within our lifetimes, Dunwich could be no more. But there are still some tangible remnants under the sea. Medieval Dunwich hasn't, as you might expect, been broken up and just washed away by the North Sea. Marine archaeology has shown that the ruins of lots of the buildings are still out there, broken up, of course, into smaller fragments, but in the locations more or less where they fell, just under the sea. Divers have gone down and seen towers of churches covered in sponges, crabs and lobsters, and the locations help with mapping the street layout from centuries ago. But perhaps the greatest legacy is less tangible in the powerful sense of loss that you get when visiting Dunwich. Defoe writes that the fate of Dunwich affected him more than the ruins of Carthage, Rome, or other ancient cities, because they fell because of human actions. The other ones, invasion and the fall of great civilizations they were central to, whereas Dunwich's ruins speak more of inescapable fate that humanity just has no powers to quell. I think that's Dunwich's poetic legacy.
Powerful stuff. And I think you feel that when you visit. It feels like you're at the edge of the world. It is a tiny village now. Only 84 people live in Dunwich today. So just a village. And in the end, it does appear to be meeting the fate of the Doggerland prehistoric villages. And, I never thought that you could go diving and see that stuff. I wonder if that's a future opportunity for a visit. Get on your wetsuit.
Well, there's very poor visibility. That's the one thing. You can't see very far in front of your face. So I think you have to know what you're doing. But there have been scans of the seafloor as well, which have been very helpful in finding where all the remnants are.
Well, I went to Dunwich for my GCSE geography project to measure the slope of the beach. And I did that using some giant ruler device. But I was very pleased because I used Excel to plot the slope of the beach, which in those days was very sophisticated for me. And my entire geography project fitted onto a single floppy disk.
Excellent.
Some people might remember what that is.
It's the save icon for today's generation.
The save icon. From lost forms of file storage back to lost cities, the second lost city we're discussing is a place I've not been to, which is Old Sarum. And I've not been there, which means I've broken a golden rule of the podcast. Normally, we both visit a place before we cover it, which is why we left out the Doggerland. I've not been here, so I'm looking forward to you telling me all about Old Sarum.
You might well have been near it. You might well have been to Salisbury, because Old Sarum essentially was the predecessor, the old version of Salisbury. We talked a bit about the establishment of Salisbury in our last episode, but we're going to go back now to what was there before. Now, Old Sarum is in Wiltshire, towards the southwest of England, and we have picked it because it is a fantastic example of a medieval city that has been picked up from one place and completely transplanted elsewhere a couple of miles down the road to Salisbury. If you've never seen or heard of Old Sarum before, do search for pictures of it. Search immediately, and you'll instantly understand why we're talking about it. I think the word imposing is well overused for aesthetic descriptions, but it's exactly right for the ruins that you can see there. The entire city sat on a huge Iron Age hill fort, which remains there today, with a castle on a motte and a cathedral. The motte was effectively a hill on a hill. This was a city with all the medieval gear, the castle and cathedral, reduced today to just English heritage ruins. What else is great about Old Sarum is how its construction covers all ages of civilization in Britain from the Iron Age onwards. The outer ramparts were built possibly around 400 BC, and the area was occupied by the Romans with a possible Roman fort on the hill. The Normans built the first castle and cathedral shortly after the Norman conquest, while both were rebuilt in stone in the early 12th centuries. So this place really does give us some major talking points.
It does. It's certainly impressive in that rendered image that you've shared and that you can find online. What are the origins of Old Sarum, and how important was it?
It is an ancient city. The hill fort site on which it sits, as we said, was occupied separately in numerous different eras, from Iron Age Roman, Saxon and Norman eras right up to the 13th century. That continuous reoccupation of this site is a good example of how contemporary political concerns drove the nature of settlements. The Saxons were the latest to resettle the site before its abandonment in 1003 because it offered safety from the Vikings. But its major institutions were only about 150 years old at its abandonment. The castle was built in 1070, and it was only made a religious see in 1058, with the cathedral built from 1075 to 1092 in the northwest part of the hill. The castle was one of a number expanded by Henry II to consolidate his power after the anarchy, the civil war that preceded him. And it was here, actually, that he imprisoned his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, for 16 years. At the same point, the castle alterations were being made.
Pretty impressive place. What happened to it?
Old Sarum was almost completely abandoned when the cathedral city was moved to the Salisbury new town by the Bishop of Salisbury. Permission to move was granted in 1219, so only 150 years after the cathedral's construction. And this happened predominantly because the area's greatest strength in times of war, the fact it sat on this hill, had become its weakness in times of peace. There was no space to expand on the limited area of the hill fort. Another reason suggests also perhaps the lack of well water in the region, which led to the move. As some more context, there had been quite a lot of expansion and Romanesque reconstruction of major Saxon churches in the late 11th and early 12th centuries, and many other sees were moved from tiny settlements to bigger urban centres. But wholesale movement of towns was very rare after the Norman conquest. Old Sarum to Salisbury is almost the only major example. Now, when the move to Salisbury happened, the cathedral was demolished and the rubble was taken to Salisbury for construction work at the new cathedral there. The old city was left to ruin and the castle rapidly deteriorated too, until Henry VIII finally allowed the remaining building material to be carried off and used for other purposes.
It's an extraordinary undertaking for the time to move all that material. There must have been really strong and compelling reasons for doing it. What's the legacy of Old Sarum?
Unlike Dunwich, there really is no settlement at all now in Old Sarum. But what this does mean is that you have the entire area of the city preserved up on that hill, though, of course, in a ruined and uncovered state. You can visit today and see the hill itself, the motte and the bailey, plus the foundations of the castle buildings and foundations of the cathedral. And like Dunwich, there was the same political legacy, with Old Sarum remaining a barely occupied parliamentary constituency, electing MPs from 1295 until 1832. By the time the constituency was abolished, Old Sarum was a totally uninhabited hill, despite returning two MPs. It's shown in a bleak 1829 painting by John Constable, which gives you some idea of how barren and deserted it was. It's worth also here touching just very briefly on the legacy of the new replacement town of Salisbury, without wanting to impinge on any separate episode we might do on Salisbury. The construction itself was important in providing a great example of a true grid pattern in a medieval planned street layout in the St Edmunds area built in the 1260s. Now, I say true grid here because it contains exact right angles. The technical term for such a pattern is orthogonal, and this was the second orthogonal street pattern built in England after Bury St Edmunds. Now, grid patterns of streets were not as common in England as in French planned towns. Often street plans were just adapted to existing ones, and true orthogonal plans were difficult to set out. But Salisbury, as a new town in a fresh area, this blank urban slate, you might say, gave a great chance to plan precisely. And you can see this clearly in the street pattern of this area now.
That's fantastic. So you've given us two things, two places to visit and look out for. We've all got to go to Old Sarum, which is an English heritage site today. And also, next time we're in Salisbury, look for those right angles. That sounds fascinating.
Yep, you can definitely see them there today.
Well, I can't wait to visit Old Sarum. The next city that's lost is Silchester. Now, Silchester today, it still exists, doesn't it? 921 people live there from the records I've just found online, but it was much more important in its day.
Now, the Silchester of today is a small village just down the road from me near Reading in the southeast of England. But about half a mile outside today's village is the site of the Roman town Caleva Atrabatum. We've picked this place because it is a unique example of a major Roman town that dwindled to nothing really after the Romans left Britain and was never re-established. And as a consequence of that, it's been barely touched by urban development. So we've been left this site to excavate without major subsequent rebuilding works obscuring it. One admin point now, we are going to refer to the Roman town as Silchester today, even though technically the village of Silchester is that distinct area away from the Roman town. But just to keep things simple, what most people call it, we'll call it the Silchester Roman town.
So you've said this originated as a Roman town. So when was it founded?
I think it's really impressive just how long this town lasted, how long ago it was established and how long it continued. It was established early after the Roman conquest and only abandoned after this. So that's over half a millennium of a thriving settlement from the 1st century AD onwards, which means it lasted about 10 times more than Milton Keynes has today. Silchester was originally an Iron Age oppidum, an Iron Age town, and probably a capital of the Atrebates tribe, hence the name of the Roman town, Caliva Atrebatum. There was already lots of international trade going through the town at this point, but it really became a major town after the Roman conquest. The Romans probably built there because Silchester was this existing tribal capital. It didn't have the advantage of being near any major rivers like the Thames, but it did offer good visibility from high ground, so was naturally secure. The location also offered lots of accessible well water below the ground, and it was at the end of the Devil's Highway, a Roman road linking it with Londinium, London in the east, and to further Roman settlements in the west. The Romans built Silchester up, and excavations have shown that it had all the usual hallmarks of good Roman urban living. It had a grid pattern, a basilica, a spring and baths, temples, shops, amphitheatre and houses.
So an important place for the Romans, but what led to its downfall?
That's a very intriguing question, especially because the site had such a long history of continuous occupation. And as most major Roman settlements in this country continued into the Middle Ages, all were refounded later. Also, because Caliva Atrebatum, Silchester Roman town, continued to be populated after the Romans formally abandoned Britain. Maybe, though this is disputed, up to perhaps the 6th or 7th century AD, with the first record of the modern village down the road in the 11th century, quite some distance from the Roman town. More intriguingly, there is some evidence that the abandonment of Silchester Roman town was a deliberate act rather than some kind of gradual response to events. The town's wells were filled in deliberately, while some archaeologists suggest that the town was ritually cursed at the point the population left. Unlike with Old Sarum, we may unfortunately never know for sure why Silchester was abandoned, but Michael Fulford, who is the leading archaeological expert on Silchester, suggests that pressure from the Anglo-Saxon settlement in nearby Dorchester may have played a significant part in the abandonment. Well, Derek Keane thinks the fact it had no access to the sea may have played a role. Remember, it wasn't near the coast, it wasn't near a river either. What's also a bit of a mystery is the lack of resettlement, which was actually very common for lots of earlier abandoned Roman towns. It is possible there could have been a very small castle built on the Roman defences here in the 12th century during the anarchy. It's also worth considering that there were many small wooden castles across the country at this time that didn't continue to have any significance later, Ipswich Castle being one. There may have been a small village attached to this castle if it existed, possibly a church in the Roman city area. There is one today. English Heritage said this would have been abandoned around 1400, possibly because of the Black Death. But there was never again anything like the lost Roman city.
And this leaves us with a pretty cool place to visit today.
It does. The main reasons to visit Silchester today are to see the extensive Roman walls built in the 3rd century and the amphitheatre outside the walls. This is definitely the best preserved Roman wall in the country, a Roman urban wall, I should say, and circles the whole area of the Roman town, so you can get a huge appreciation for the Roman town scale. Now, while most Roman buildings within the walls have disappeared above the ground, destroyed by centuries of farming, we know a lot about the town's layout because of huge excavation works carried out in the late 19th and mainly early 20th centuries. The first major excavations were ordered by the Duke of Wellington, son of the Duke of Wellington, who owned the land, and excavations do continue to this day. As well as the town streetscape, you have the remains of one of the oldest Christian churches in England. And within the town walls, one notable post-Roman survival is another church, the Church of St. Mary the Virgin. It's at least 800 years old. It might be on the site of a Roman temple and possibly could have reused building material from that, which wasn't uncommon in the Middle Ages. The Silchester Trail suggests that material from here was also used in the construction of Reading Abbey, so possibly another Roman remnant carried on today.
In episode 2, I believe, of this podcast, we went to Reading and we had a great time. And we spoke about the Reading Museum, which contains 2 important remnants from Silchester.
It does. First is the Ogham Stone, a stone with an inscription of Ogham, which is an ancient Irish language. Apologies if I've got the pronunciation wrong. The excavation of the Ogham Stone is important because this is the only Ogham inscription found in England outside Devon and Cornwall, and therefore suggests an Irish population speaking a language that probably didn't exist before the 5th century, implying there would have been a continuing population of Silchester after Roman administration of Britain ended. More broadly, though, Silchester has an intangible legacy in the popular imagination. The Silchester Eagle, a small eagle statue excavated from the basilica, and probably part of a larger statue, inspired the book on which the 2011 film The Eagle is based, while the Roman name of Caliva Atrabatum is used in a local non-league football club, Tadley Caliva, nicknamed the Romans.
And there I was thinking we'd get through an episode without mentioning a football reference.
Can't
there
do
you
that.
go.
Sorry.
There you go. Just that
YeOldeGuide rule.
Such the prominence of football in British society. Well, we have one more lost settlement for you. And we discussed this in the last episode, didn't we? We were talking about medieval towns. We were talking about medieval new towns. And you mentioned Winchelsea.
Now, Winchelsea is in Sussex on the southeast coast of England. And we have picked it because it is a wonderful example of a Norman new town, but one that failed to prosper as planned, with remaining physical evidence that you can easily see today. Now, this is probably the least lost of all the cities we've looked at today, because there was some continuation of urban life, even reoccupation of abandoned plots later. Plus, it does continue today as a small town. However, it is very small and sparsely occupied. And unlike Salisbury or Bury St Edmunds, hasn't come anywhere near outgrowing its small Norman grid. In fact, the area of the town has actually retracted significantly since its original laying out. So I think it definitely qualifies for our attention.
And, how important was Winchelsea?
Looking at its origins, we went into the background of Norman new towns or plantations in our medieval cities episode, but briefly, there were hundreds of new settlements established as genuinely planned new towns across England from the Norman conquest up to 1350. Motivations varied, but Winchelsea's importance really lay in its military importance to Edward I. It was built as part of Edward I's military ambitions, with his need to assert military dominance on multiple fronts, including Wales, the Scottish borders, and on the coast. In scale and wealth, relatively speaking, Winchelsea was never as significant as the other towns we've covered today, but it was an important port for Edward I's ships, so like his great Welsh castles and associated cities, a critical point on the coastal battlefront. The more localised reason why it came to exist is because, once again, this town was built to replace an earlier one. It's the other main example of this, along with Old Sarum and Salisbury. The town and port of Old Winchelsea, as we'll call it, had been destroyed by storms, including a major one in 1297. Edward I commissioned construction in the 1280s of the new town on higher protected ground, and even visited the construction site personally.
So it was clearly important and meant a lot to the king. So what eventually happened to Winchelsea?
Well, this new town on the higher ground was really just too large, and it never filled its planned area. This wasn't just planners' hubris. The town's economy was hit hard by wars with France, which reduced its coastal trade in wine, plus the silting up of the town's harbour. And all this did hit the town very quickly. Evidence from the 1340s shows abandoned plots even then, particularly in the south and west of the town, while by the 1360s, there was more dereliction in the centre. Finally, and contrasting with many other major and expanding European cities which expanded beyond their original walled areas, a royal commission of 1415 actually led to smaller town defences being put up, as it said, because the site is now too large for the inhabitants, reflecting the diminished inhabited area.
So what's the legacy of Winchelsea?
The visual legacy is what I love about it. You can still see just the medieval grid pattern town with unlike with Salisbury, no subsequent expansion around it and the large vacant areas between the planned plots. Compare this with the other medieval gridded towns that we know of today. They are prime land full of buildings, usually surrounded by subsequent expansion. And this allows us to appreciate the planned nature of these towns, with streets at right angles with plots in between.
So why are the plots so regular? What's the point of these gridded towns?
No, that's very interesting. It's been suggested this might have been a kind of accounting decision to help make the plots regular, which allowed you to calculate the rents accurately. And this, it's been surmised, is also why the streets of Winchelsea are all completely straight, but not all parallel. It means some plots come out as trapezium shaped and are slightly bigger than others because they were designed like that to give a higher rentable value. Essentially, you have some small plots, some big plots, but within a grid pattern. This would have meant the grid pattern gave, if anything, more complexity to the town's construction, not less, as you might expect. It's also worth noting that what you can see now is actually a reduced version of the original town as set out by Edward's planners. If you want an impression of how Winchelsea was supposed to be, look at how far out of the town the surviving southern gate is. You can search for that on Google Maps. It's almost a mile from the southern border. And I will just also add at this point, if you want an even more extreme example of a grid-planned medieval new town that's disappeared completely, look at Newtown on the Isle of Wight. This was another Norman plantation which was really just practically disappeared as a settlement, apart from a slightly bizarre, slightly eerie outsized 1699 town hall, which sits strangely on its own next to a track between two fields. The grid-like pattern of streets in Newtown is now a grid-like pattern of fields, easily visible on Google Maps.
And is there anything else left in Winchelsea?
Yeah, there's other tangible legacies. You've got evidence of the medieval trades there. The merchants in Winchelsea were in the north of the town, and you can still see the entrances to some of their storage cellars from their extensive involvement in the French wine trade. If you can't go, just check Google Maps, look at Street View, you can see it there. And you can also see the original town gates, and you can see the town museum in the court hall of 1294. So yes, plenty that you can see today.
Well, thank you, Daniel. We've had a fantastic and enjoyable exploration of 4 of the lost cities of England. Was Atlantis actually Dunwich, do we think? Silly question.
Possibly. Well, you wouldn't be able to live in any of the houses that are under there now. They're all broken up. But
the lost city...
England's Atlantis, perhaps.
Well, if you've enjoyed this episode, please leave a rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. You can find all our episodes at YeOldeGuide.com. You can see all the cities that we've visited and our league table of cities by historical interest, which we might have a little review of in our next episode. And thank you to Jack for reminding me that we need to tie up some loose ends on our Liverpool episode. Don't worry, that's in the works as well. So check out all our episodes at YeOldeGuide.com. Leave reviews, leave ratings. Thank you very much. See you next time. Goodbye.
Bye.